Hey guys, we are going to start one of my favorite subjects, political institutions. So, you had an assignment last week. We're starting to kind of review for the national exam. Friday the 22nd, next week, next uh, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Wednesday, Thursday. Look on Canvas, I have those dates. I've got two Zoom meetings set up that will go over what your answers, a little bit more specifically, what you can look forward to seeing on the test. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over political institutions, and we're going to look at it from the perspective of what impact political institutions have on democracy. So let's look at that. So we've got a couple of vocab terms I want to, or just kind of concepts before we get into what your homework was. Concepts to review. So the first idea would be this separation of powers. So separation of powers is when you have a government. So if you have a totalitarian government, there is no separation of powers, or an authoritarian government, there's limited separation of powers. So the idea of when you are going to create a more democratic country is you're going to separate powers between individual groups of people. So all power isn't rested with an individual or even one body of people, one group of people. Checks and balances are related to separation of powers, but it is not necessarily the same thing. The idea of checks and balances is once you have separated powers, then it is kind of like a game of rock, paper, scissors, and you create a system where one group or one institution has power or authority over another in one regard, and then that has authority over the original one in a different regard. So usually we look at the institutions, executive, judicial, legislative, and the kind of triangle that they all have power over each other. So when we talk about power, there's different kinds of power, and this is really probably the most important thing when we talk about what makes a country authoritarian or democratic, because really everything that is on this scale of a democracy is one place. Or hold on, remind me later, don't you think we should remind me later here? Let's go back. Okay. Everything is on that scale one way or another. All the way to one end is authoritarian. All the way to the other is democratic. Free and fair elections, civil rights and liberties. No free and fair elections, no guaranteed civil rights and liberties. Most countries kind of land somewhere on that spectrum in the middle. So this is the idea of formal power and informal power. If you're going to look at a country like Russia, constitutionally in 1999, it was set up to be a democracy, but it is not fully a democracy. It's probably more authoritarian. It's further down this scale than even towards democracy. On the way, it passed something called an illiberal democracy. That's kind of the halfway point, or a substantive or formative democracy. Those are two different terms. All right, kind of lost in the weeds there a little bit. So let's look at the idea of formal versus informal power. Formal power is something that's granted by the Constitution. The power of Congress is to create laws. Informal power, even in a country that has a formally written constitution that guarantees the legislature has the ability to create laws, you might have an executive or a president that uses informal power based on their personality or culture of the government in general, or leverage. Leverage is the idea of power that you have, kind of something that you hold over somebody else. It could be that their job is on the line. You could fire them from their job. Maybe you're the head of a political party and you oversee everybody within that party. And if they don't meet your will, then they are out of a job. That would be informal power, because it's not written in the Constitution. It is a form of leverage that you have over somebody else. And that is usually what sways a government that is supposed to be democratic towards authoritarian, would be this position of informal power. There are different types of informal power in every country that we talk about. Remember, we talked about clientelism in Mexico, and there's this kind of patron-client relationships where the government has brought different interest groups under the fold of the government by giving them special favors in return for support. That is not written in the Constitution, but it allows them to maintain power based on this kind of informal network. In China, it is the idea of guanxi, which means relationships, pretty much the same thing. Nomenclatura is the same idea in Russia. In Nigeria, it is prebendalism, which is basically just kind of a form of payment, paying people off. It's just a little bit more straightforward corruption than the other forms that we've looked at. So formal versus informal is an important thing to look at. Then we've got just kind of, we're going to quickly go over what the three major branches are in every country, and what their function are, and then we'll review what they look like in each country. So executive. An executive's job is always to carry out the laws, enforce the laws, or execute. That's where it comes from, the laws of a country. So if you're going to look back at formal power versus informal, the president of Russia, for instance, his job is to enforce the law, not to create the law. However, if you look at the next one, the legislative function is to create the laws. The president of Russia uses that power, that informal power, to dominate the legislature to create laws that he wants them to create, basically to rubber stamp them. Just later, man, technical difficulties. To just rubber stamp every law that he creates is pushed through the legislature using an informal power. Actually, let's keep looking at this. So every country either has a single executive or a dual executive. If you're going to look at Russia, start with Mexico, has a single executive. It is the president. That's it. The United Kingdom is a dual executive. You have a prime minister and a monarch. So the prime minister is the head of government. The monarch is the head of state. Let's fast forward to Iran. Iran is also a dual executive, has a president and the supreme leader. The president is the head of government. The supreme leader is the head of state. So it is not necessarily the head of state that is the more, just by being called the head of state, isn't necessarily the more powerful executive. That all depends on the way the formal and informal power shakes out in an individual country. So the United Kingdom, clearly the head of government, the prime minister, is the most powerful position in that country. And that is largely reflects it being a democratic system. The culture of the country is to promote democracy, the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, that all major decisions should rest in elected officials rather than a monarch who is an unelected official. Okay, so you have the single versus dual executive. Mexico, single. United Kingdom, dual executive. China, dual executive, but really what we talked about earlier is their executive is probably constitutionally the weakest. It is actually, the weird part is the power is constitutionally spread out quite a bit through different groups of people, because the Communist Party, this informal piece, is really who runs the show. And so the most powerful position would be the Secretary General of the Communist Party, and then they use the government to rubber stamp any policy that they want to create. And that would be this informal power that the party has co-opted the government, basically taken over the government, created laws to use the government to create laws to basically further embed them in power for the future. Okay, so then we also have, let's go forward, legislative. Legislative branch is to create laws. That is their only position, their primary function. You've got two different types of legislature: unicameral, which is just one group of people that create laws, and a bicameral, which is two groups of people that create laws. If you're a federal system of government, we're going to look at this, and that is when you divide power between the central and regional governments, you have to have a bicameral legislature, because you have to have the regions represented centrally in the legislature. Like the United States is a great example. You have a Senate that the states are represented, and the House of Representatives that the population or the people are represented. And so if you're going to look at the United Kingdom, it is not a federal system of government because their regions are not represented in the central government. However, it is bicameral because you have two houses. You have the House of Commons that represents population, and then the House of Lords, which really just represents kind of tradition. It is a completely unelected legislative body. So in that regard, all federal systems are bicameral, but not all bicameral systems are federal. That makes sense. And then a unicameral is just one group that creates policies. So let's go over this. Mexico, bicameral, also federal. United Kingdom, bicameral, but unitary. China is unicameral. The National People's Congress is basically the world's biggest rubber stamp using informal power. They have actually never rejected anything that they have voted on because if it makes it to the legislative body, it is a foregone conclusion that it will be passed. So it is a unicameral and a unitary state. Russia is bicameral and federal. Iran, unicameral and unitary. And then Nigeria is a federal system and also a bicameral legislature. So if you look at all of those pieces, they match up with what we talked about earlier between federal systems and bicameral legislatures. Okay, so the whole thing that we're looking at, we're trying to look at these institutions through the lens of how they can affect a democracy. And the most significant institution in affecting a democracy is the judicial branch. Their job is to interpret laws. Now, there's two different types of laws. Code law, and that is a law that is written and followed to the code, basically. So the legislature creates a law, it cannot be interpreted any other way than it is written. And the judicial branch interprets the law clearly the way it's written. Common law is the idea that laws evolve. Laws evolve with the time, and that future rulings will look back on previous rulings. So a good example of common law in the United States would be, we have the freedom of speech. And that, if it was code law, it was just, hey, you can speak against the government. But because we have a more common law system, that law has evolved to incorporate lots of different things. We have freedom of speech. You have freedom of expression because that freedom of speech law has been interpreted to encompass freedom of expression as well. In the Texas v. Johnson case, when somebody burned a flag, that says that the Supreme Court ruled, yeah, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, they're all both kind of the same thing. In a code law system, they wouldn't interpret it that way. You would have to pass a new law in order to encompass that. So the connection to an authoritarian government is much more likely to have a code law system than a common law system. However, that doesn't, just because it's code law, doesn't necessarily mean it is an authoritarian country. Here's the thing. Judicial review is similar to common law. Judicial review is the court's ability to overturn actions of other institutions. This is perhaps the most important thing that dictates whether or not a country is democratic, that it fully checks itself from becoming too powerful. So, however, if a country does not have judicial review, it can still be democratic and can still have free and fair elections and guaranteed civil rights and liberties. But the most important institution in general to have in a democratic country is always the judicial branch, because its job is to make sure that the rule of law is being followed, that the government is not only creating fair laws that are that line up with the Constitution, but then that are also being enforced the right way. So if you look back at the legislative branch, if a country practices judicial review and has that built into its system, if the legislative branch creates a law that violates the Constitution, the judicial branch can say, not so fast, you can't do that. Or if the executive branch attempts to carry out policies that are inconsistent with what the Constitution says, the judicial branch can rule against them. And that is also true for the rights or civil rights and liberties of the individuals. That's probably the most important thing in a democratic country, guaranteed civil rights and liberties. The judicial branch, it is one thing to create those laws, it's another thing to actually enforce it and make sure that those laws are evenly being applied to citizens around the country. So independent judicial branch is by far the most important branch institution in a democratic country. Okay, so that's a quick overview of what institutions are. I want to quickly look at your homework as well and talk about a couple of these questions. We'll just kind of briefly go over these two. So I explained the difference between presidential and parliamentary system, selection of the executive. For the first thing, in a presidential systems, presidents are elected by separately than the legislature. I was going to say by the citizens, but not necessarily. I guess China's not necessarily true. So president, the executive branch is clearly separate from the legislative branch. In a parliamentary system, the legislature appoints the head, the executive. So the United Kingdom is a good example of that. You vote for your member of the House of Commons, and then the House of Commons chooses who the prime minister or the executive is going to be. So legislative checks over the executive in a presidential system. You can have the legislature vote to impeach a president, and in a parliamentary system, you can have a legislature actually vote to remove a prime minister. The difference is that is less likely to happen in a parliamentary system, because in a parliamentary system, that would be the same person that they chose to be the prime minister. So something pretty egregious would have to happen to vote to have them removed. Usually it would divide a political party, not just the government. Where in a presidential system, you might have a member of one political party be president, and then the majority of the Congress or the legislature be of a different political party. You're more likely to see that kind of confrontation happen in a presidential system. And then executive checks over the legislative. You can, in a presidential system, you can veto any law that is created by the president. In Russia, that's why Russia would be considered kind of semi-presidential. In Russia, they wrote right in the Constitution, the president can eliminate the Duma, fire the Duma, dissolve the Duma, when the lower house of their legislature, really whenever they want. And then executive checks over the legislature in a parliamentary system. They can always call for early elections. So you can say pretty much the same thing as the Duma situation that I talked about earlier, but the difference would be in a parliamentary system, the prime minister's job would be on the hook as well, where in Russia, you could just fire the whole Duma and not worry about your own job as president. All right, Mexico, presidential. United Kingdom, parliamentary. Russia, semi-presidential. China, semi-presidential. Iran, semi-presidential. Not because it's parliamentary necessarily, but because it is also you've got the role of the guardian council and supreme leader, which is kind of a different situation altogether. And then Nigeria, you have a presidential system. So you've got these positions here. And rather than go over what all of them do, let's kind of go down here and look at your assignment was to research these 6 different institutions from the different countries and then write a thesis statement about which one you believe to be the most powerful in the country they're from. So let's kind of go over the strengths and weaknesses of each one, and then I'll tell you what I think the answer is. Not necessarily could be, okay? There's no necessarily right or wrong answer to this. House of Commons in the United Kingdom, definitely the most powerful institution in its country. It has the idea, it is the sole legislative and houses the most powerful executive in its country. However, it is a democracy, and so like what we talked about earlier, the judicial branch still has power to overturn something it does that is unconstitutional or goes against its written code of laws. The Mexican president, powerful largely for informal reasons. They serve a one term, so they serve 1 6-year term, which makes them kind of like dead on arrival to a certain extent, because they don't have to, they never get to get reelected. That is a strength and a weakness, because they don't have to really worry about what they do that is popular to the public, because they're not worried about getting reelected. However, they also they lack a decent amount of informal power, because their leverage runs out the further they get into their term. However, I mean, Mexico now is different than it used to be. Under the PRI, it was just kind of steamrolling, and so that leverage passed on to the next president. Now you've got kind of different presidents from different political parties, so you don't have that same kind of leverage. The Russian Duma. The Russian Duma is a legislative body by name. Constitutionally, its power is to create laws. But since Putin has been in control since 1999, they are his rubber stamp, meaning he can't formally create laws. He needs them to do that for them. So that's what they do. National People's Congress. You could say the National People's Congress is also the most powerful, because they create any laws without any pushback from any other institution. The thing is the National People's Congress is kind of a puppet for the CCP. So the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, they occupy the National People's Congress, and they make the decisions. This isn't a situation where people of different opinions sit in the National People's Congress and argue with each other over the best policy. It is a situation where the party comes in and says, this is what our policy should be. Guardian Council in Iran. It is unelected. It is a very powerful organization. They get to approve anyone who runs for president. They get to approve anyone who runs for the Majlis, which is their parliament or their legislature. They can overturn policies created by the legislature. But at the same time, they have somebody that is over them at every turn, which is the Supreme Leader. And the Supreme Leader can overturn anything that they do. So a lot of power, but there's a significant check on their power as well, while they check everybody else. And then the Nigerian president. The Nigerian president, the whole institutional system in Nigeria is basically stolen from the United States, or it is not stolen, it is a very similar, it's kind of a replica of the United States, a federal presidential system. And the president does have significant power, mostly for informal reasons, less because of its constitutional power. So the Nigerian president, because Nigeria is so fractured ethnically, religiously, economically, they are the most powerful institution in Nigeria, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have complete authority over all of the citizens in the country. A lot of the citizens in the country don't recognize them as a legitimate ruler, which kind of leads to the national question of Nigeria. Should Nigeria be a country? Which is a separate discussion. So I would say this in order. I would say the most powerful in its country would be House of Commons, number 1. I would say number 2, number 3, number 4, number, I would say 5 and 6 here, just kind of tied. Now, all of them are all very powerful, but it really comes down to what is behind them, and really the sovereignty that, or the authority that they have over their country as a whole. I hope this helps shed some light on some things. If you have any questions, please, as always, let me know. Hope everybody's well. Looking forward to seeing you.